Hubris with a U is often seen as pride in excess of your actual accomplishments in modern English, but the ancient Greek concept went much further than the watered-down version that we know of today. Hubris with a Y in the classics, or with an upsilon in Greek, encompassed everything from violent crimes to deliberate public shaming to offending the gods and a heck of a lot more. It's an important concept to understand and a mainstay of many of the myths, as well as the tragic flaw of every Greek hero. So, let's take a look at hubris. Hubris is an incredibly complex topic, heavily debated by scholars who have spent their entire lives studying it. I'm just a YouTuber who spends way too much time researching ancient Greece and practicing a reconstructed modern Hellenism, so you'll likely find one scholar or another who disagrees with my takes here. Heck, maybe even you do. I'm gonna do my best to summarize the scholarly opinions I have access to and some of their disagreements, as well as point out when I'm giving my own opinion based on the papers and monographs I read to put this video together. My aim is for this to be a practical guide by the end, so modern Hellenists can understand the basics of both the legal concept of hubris in ancient Greece, as well as the religious significance of it. As I pointed out in my beginner mistakes video, link is in the iCard if you missed it, many modern pagans are so trained by latent Christianity to be afraid of pride that they mistake legitimate pride over their actual accomplishments for a perceived attitude of hubris. I'm gonna give a quick trigger warning that applies to the entire video, because many acts considered hubris in ancient times are violent and could be traumatizing, especially for those who have experienced bullying or non-consensual acts that were perpetrated against them. Consider this a trigger warning for most of the rest of the video on bullying, insults, non-consent, and physical violence, as there will be mentions of all of these things throughout, and I don't want to have to trigger warning each and every one of them when the central theme of the video does imply this sort of violence throughout. This video will be divided into 3 parts. The first will summarize Aristotle's views on hubris and what kind of actions fall under the categories, as well as the sorts of attitudes that certain people have that lead to these actions. Part 2 will cover the legal codes and cases related to hubris in ancient Athens to see what hubristic acts could be brought to trial, and one of the examples of such a trial that we've seen that uses it in many different contexts, as well as what modern Hellenists might want to refrain from doing, as the gods were said to have a place in human justice of that sort. Finally, Part 3 will cover mythological hubris with a focus on Homer and Hesiod, though we'll also briefly look at hubris in Attic tragedy, as hubris was often a major theme. As always, links will be in the description to my sources. I highly encourage you to pick up some of those monographs if you can afford them and parse through them, or check out the papers responding to them on JSTOR. If you'd like to help me afford those expensive monographs to do deep dives like this in the future, link is also in the description to my Patreon, and to my Etsy store, where both artists who help out with the channel and I have been steadily putting out god and channel themed merch. Our first design is an adorable Kerberos from whom there is no escape in Hades. Isn't he precious? No pressure either way though. A like and a subscribe can also seriously help out the channel, as can a comment at the end if you want more people to see my work. Without further ado, let's get into it. Part 1. Defining hubris, Aristotle edition. The first and most important thing I need to get out of the way is this. Hubris referred to specific acts of a specific nature done with specific intentions, not just to a general internal attitude. Now, there are some scholars who disagree with me, but the evidence that I've seen very much points to it, and Fisher, who wrote the big monograph on hubris, tends to agree with me here, as does Aristotle, as we'll see. Though there is a specific attitude that leads to committing hubristic acts, and we should probably as Hellenists focus on developing virtue and charis to avoid said attitude, it was the act itself that was the hubris and made someone a hubristos, or hubristic person, not some kind of thought crime. That said, one of the qualifications for a hubristic act does involve the intention and the attitude it's done with, so we do need to dig a bit into how we figure out what is hubris and what isn't to find that nuance. No ancient Greek philosopher wrote more about hubris or defined it more specifically than Aristotle, who devoted large sections of rhetoric, Nicomachean ethics, and politics to its discussions. We'll start with rhetoric. Large sections of Book 2 are devoted to analysis of various emotions and how stimulating them in an audience can produce different effects, and Aristotle opens with anger and its causes. He tells us first that anger is a mix of pain caused by perceived or actual slight and the pleasure at the thought of revenge, for if the slight is actual, revenge was considered virtuous in ancient Greece. Hubris, on the other hand, we are told, is of an entirely different nature. Again, he's describing acts here and the attitude that leads to them. Similarly, he who commits hubris against another also slights him, for hubris, translated as insult in the original version of this translation, consists in causing injury or annoyance whereby the sufferer is disgraced, not to obtain any other advantage for oneself besides the performance of the act, but for one's own pleasure. For retaliation is not hubris, but punishment. The cause of pleasure felt by those who commit hubris is the idea that, in ill-treating others, they are more fully showing superiority. That is why the young and the wealthy are given to hubris, for they think that, in committing them, they are showing their superiority. Dishonor is characteristic of hubris, and one who dishonors another slights him, for that which is worthless has no value, either as good or evil. Hence, Achilles in his wrath exclaims, "He has dishonored me, and since he keeps the prize he has taken for himself and has treated me like a dishonored vagrant," as if himself being angry for these reasons. So we have hubris first defined as acts which dishonor others for no sake other than the pleasure they are done for. The word that is translated as slighting here, oligoria, actually means something nastier than what we'd think of in English. It effectively means articulating or demonstrating an opinion that someone or something else is completely worthless to you. Aristotle continues, telling us who is most likely to commit this sort of hubris. Now, men think that they have a right to be highly esteemed by those who are inferior to them in birth, power, or virtue, and generally in whatever similar respect a man is far superior to another. For example, the rich man to the poor man in the matter of money, the eloquent to the incompetent speaker in the matter of oratory, the governor to the governed, and the man who thinks himself worthy to rule, and one who is fit only to be ruled. So, people who consider themselves to be higher than others in skill due to birth or rank and wealth need to be especially careful that they don't commit hubristic acts. Now keep in mind, Aristotle isn't saying that displaying appropriate pride in your accomplishments is hubris here, far from it. Instead, he's saying that hubristic acts are those in which someone intentionally sets out to point out someone else's position as lower than theirs, specifically for the pleasure of it. Though later in politics, he'll talk about how doing so in order to get clout also qualifies. So if you've ever run into someone online who seems to take a sadistic pleasure in taking down other people, whether they deserve it or not, in order to gain clout, there's a chance at least that person is committing hubris if the slights they're going after aren't actually justified. These sorts of acts can extend past simple verbal insults and public shaming and into the realm of violence. In Eudemian Ethics, Aristotle points out that cheating men often deny hubris by claiming that they were compelled in some way, not merely seeking pleasure. What makes adultery specifically hubris is the shame and anger it inspires in the partner who is cheated on, which in the modern day I would argue makes polyamory not adultery, given that consent means that anger and shame are typically not a consequence of it. Anyhow, here is the quote from Eudemian Ethics. For example, a man is not an adulterer because he exceeds in intercourse with married women, for excess does not apply here, but adultery merely in itself is a vice, since the term denoting the passion implicitly denotes that the man is vicious, and similarly with hubris. Hence, men dispute the charge, admit intercourse but deny adultery on the ground that they have acted in ignorance or under compulsion, or admit striking a blow but deny committing hubris, and similarly in meeting the other charges of the same kind. Striking a blow brings up another form of hubris, the act of attacking someone physically for no purpose other than to belittle for the pleasure or to increase one's own status. The sort of stereotypical physical high school bullying you see in old 80s movies would fall under this category. We'll get deeper into the more violent acts of hubris, like physical bullying and non-consensual acts in part 2 when we cover the legal aspects of hubris and a few examples in Attic case law that could get someone convicted. For now, it's important to know that these sorts of violent acts fall under that same category when they were committed specifically for the pleasure of it or to gain clout and belittle the person being bullied. Fighting back would not fall under hubris, however, as it falls under the revenge clause that Aristotle talked about earlier. So if some dickhead came up to you and punched you in the face and you swung back, he might be on the hook for hubris depending on his motivations, but you're fine. Given the self-defense clauses in many modern laws, it seems that at least some ancient values still carry in modern-day case law. In politics, he discusses advice for people who wish to be single kings or tyrants, giving them said advice. Now, before we get into this, we need to talk about something briefly, which is a simple fact of ancient Athens and many parts of Greece on the whole, but is extremely uncomfortable to modern sensibilities because we have a much more finely tuned and, in my opinion, better idea of what consent is. It was very common in ancient times for older men to engage in what we would now consider inappropriate, intimate relationships with younger men. These relationships, especially if the older man was well off, could cement a important familial ties for the attractive younger men, and sometimes even resulted in a later marriage to one of the older man's daughters. One form of hubris often cited, and cited here, is a refusal to engage in proper reciprocity when such a relationship on the part of the older man. I am in no way advocating for these kinds of relationships. They're rightfully illegal in the modern day. But when he talks about offending the young and ambitious and pursuing relationships of them for reasons of passion and not power, it's important to know the context of what he is saying there. And again, he, the tyrant, should carefully avoid all forms of hubris, and two beyond all, violent and bodily punishments and hubris against the young. And this caution must especially be exercised in relation to the ambitious, for while to be slighted in regard to property annoys the lovers of wealth, slights that involve dishonor are what men of honorable ambition and high character resent. Hence the tyrant should either not consort with men of this kind, or appear to inflict his punishments paternally and not because of contempt, and to indulge in the society of the young for reasons of passion, not because he has the power. And in general, he should buy off what are thought to be dishonors by greater honors. And among those who make attempts upon the life of the ruler, the most formidable, and those against whom the greatest precaution are needed, are those ready to sacrifice their lives if they can destroy him. Hence the greatest care must be taken against those who think that insolent outrage is being done either to themselves or to those who happen to be under their care. For men attacking under the influence of anger are reckless themselves, as Heraclitus also observed when he said that anger was hard to combat because it would buy revenge with a life. This brings me to an important point. The majority of instances of hubris are broken reciprocity of some kind, be it a refusal to pay for services rendered in this case, which again I am not saying I in any way approve of, just that it was a cultural norm back then and thereby an example Aristotle uses, or a refusal to give the basic respect and dignity expected of a fellow human being when interacting with them. Reciprocity is broken between a husband and wife when one partner cheats, which of course brings that shame and anger as expected more often than not, and it's broken with the gods when an army sacks their temples. It's broken at the moment someone lies and mocks another for their own pleasure, and of course it's broken with the physical abuse of some kind happens, which we'll cover more in part 2. In part 3 we'll get into broken xenia and refusal to bury the dead out of spite, both potentially being hubris, and in both of these cases the expected reciprocity of guest and host, or regarding care of the family after they pass, are broken. Not all cases of broken reciprocity are hubris, but all of hubris is a form of broken reciprocity brought on by the selfish desire for pleasure at the expense of others. With that, let's get into legal hubris. Part 2. Hubris in law. There's an argument in the classics and in parts of the Hellenist community that hubris is a purely legal term in ancient Greece, that the gods don't intervene in these issues, or at the very least that they aren't emphasized, and most examples of mythic hubris are impossible to humans, such as escaping from Hybris or trying to serve human meat to the gods at a banquet. I think the sheer volume of mythic examples we're going to cover in the next section that are absolutely possible for modern humans and the direct involvement the gods were said to have in many of those issues speaks for itself. But there are far fewer ways that we can offend them in modern times because we don't really have the capability to say, sack an active temple as soldiers while taking a city. However, many of the violent acts of hubris described in Attic legal speeches we have surviving are absolutely possible for modern humans to do, and the gods do show up in several of these speeches as being potentially offended by them. Also, I don't know why you'd try, but a modern person could theoretically get human meat and put it on a theoxania table. The likelihood is ridiculously low, and I don't know why in the Tartaros you would do that, but it's theoretically possible. So this is just another reminder not to do that if the whole video I wrote didn't dissuade you the first time. I also hope there aren't as many violent criminals among my audience, but if there are, pay close attention to see if that crime was hubris and you might need to atone to the gods. Anyway, hubris was treated as a crime not just against the individual, but the city-state on the whole in ancient Athens. The most frequent punishments was a hefty fine payable to the city-state and not the individual offended. In other words, there was no financial impetus most of the time to bring a charge of hubris down on another person, simply the desire to have the wrong righted and perhaps to deter the person from commuting hubris and continuing their arrogant behavior. A special court could be convened, called a graphe hubris, which included a jury that decided the fate of the accused. Interestingly, none of the cases we have of speeches surviving for that involve hubris actually take place in one of these courts specifically, though several do allude to others that had. Nearly all of them were severely violent acts, often in public, though sometimes in private, though a few referenced other outrages to build a case that it was hubris, not merely assault, that the defendant is guilty of that included the less violent breaches of reciprocity. One of the big reasons Fisher speculates that these cases were held in different court might have had to do with the fact that the courts dealing with assault and battery were more likely to levy a fine payable to the victim rather than the state, and so hubris was a tacked-on charge rather than the primary focus. One of the most intense and varied speeches that we have preserved from a court regarding hubris, in which the word was used over 120 times, is the speech of Demosthenes against Medias. Because of these frequent uses, we can get an idea of what sort of acts were considered hubristic from the speech alone, though I highly suggest checking out Fisher's work on hubris if you'd like the more detailed examples and have a strong stomach for descriptions of violence. There's a lot of descriptions of violence in Attic case law. According to Rowe in his paper on the speech, there are 4 main offensive groups that we find hubris used. The first classifies his hubris as a violation of human and divine law, using words that mean wrong, impious, licentious, dishonorable, and miar, which comes from the same word tree as miasma, meaning religiously polluted. Link in the iCard if you don't know what that means. The second set classifies his offenses as shameless, audacious, arrogant, effrontery, and born of his wealth, setting up his status as the perpetrator. The third stresses the offenses themselves as disgusting, base, and worthless, and the final group contains words that emphasize the violence of his offenses, abusive, violent, and words that mean beating, or to crush against your feet. He quotes the law itself in section 47 of the speech, but one of the first things you'll notice is that it doesn't actually describe what hubris is, simply discusses what can be done if someone commits it. I can already hear the modern lawyers in the room raging. If anyone commits hubris against any child or woman or man, whether free or slave, or commits any unlawful act against any of these, any Athenian citizen who desires to do so, being qualified, may indict him before the judges, and the judges shall bring the case before the graph hubris within 30 days from the date of the indictment, unless some public business prevents it, in which case it shall be brought on the earliest possible date. Whomsoever the court shall condemn, it shall at once assess the punishment or the fine which he is considered to deserve. In all cases where an indictment is entered as the law directs, if anyone fails to prosecute, or after prosecution fails to obtain 1/5 of the votes of the jury, he shall pay 1,000 drachmas to the treasury. If he is fined for assault, he shall be imprisoned until the fine is paid, provided that the offense was committed against a freeman. That is far from an insignificant amount of money, by the way. 1 drachma was the entire day's wages for the average Greek laborer, so that's 3 years of wages. Given that the specific damages inflicted by hubris were to the honor of the victim, it seems reasonable that hubris would be repeatedly defined and described throughout a legal speech in which someone accuses someone else of it. After laying the groundwork that the plaintiff is not giving the case before the court for selfish or material reasons, but instead because Medias's transgressions affect the entire city-state, Demosthenes first levels the accusation of impiety and hubris at Medias for his continuous mocking of him during his service to the Dionysia as chorus master. 2 years ago, the tribe of Pandiones had failed to appoint a choir master, and when the assembly met, at which the law directs the archons to assign the flute players by lot to the choruses, there was a heated discussion and mutual recrimination between the archon and the overseers of the tribe. Thereupon, I came forward and volunteered to act as chorus master, and at the drawing of the lots, I was fortunate enough to get the first choice of a flute player. You Athenians, all of you, welcomed with the utmost cordiality both these incidents, my voluntary offer and my stroke of luck, and your cheers and applause expressed your approval of my conduct and your sympathy with my good fortune. But there seems to have been one solitary exception, Medias, who in his chagrin kept up a constant fire of insults, trifling or serious, during the whole period of my service. So we begin with Medias constantly insulting the plaintiff as he served as choreogos, thereby attempting to dishonor him in order to boost his own ego. But we continue into destruction of property that was sacred to the gods shortly after. The sacred apparel, for all apparel provided for use at a festival, I regard as being sacred until after it has been used, and the golden crowns which I ordered for the decoration of the choros, he plotted to destroy, men of Athens, by a nocturnal raid on the premises of my goldsmith, and he did destroy them, though not completely, for that was beyond his power, and no one can say that he ever yet heard of anyone daring or perpetrating such an outrage in this city. Destruction of sacred property is, not a good look. And someone can easily see the connections between hubris and impiety beginning to form here. The man, if we believe the account of Demosthenes, desired to put Demosthenes down so much that he destroyed an essential costumes necessary for the Dionysia to continue, thereby affronting even the gods alongside Demosthenes himself. He continues in subsequent sections to describe attempts by Medias to turn others against him with lies and trickery, constant complaining, and being an all-around thorn in his side. We've all had to work with someone like that. I'm sure the spirit of the situation must ring as familiar to a lot of us. He goes in depth as to why the jury should care, stating that he'll demonstrate a pattern of abuse and says that by virtue of this pattern, the jury will come to see that this is clearly a pattern of hubris and not merely the product of momentary passions. For what sort of pretext, what decent and moderate excuse can he show for his conduct? Anger? Possibly, that will be his plea, but whereas in cases where a sudden loss of self-control has impelled a man even to inflict such a wanton insult, it is open to him to say that he has acted in anger. If, on the other hand, he is detected in a continuous course of law-breaking, spread over many days, surely this is far from a mere fit of anger, and he stands convicted of a deliberate policy of hubris. This is an interesting point, that a momentary fit of passion or anger isn't hubris. Aristotle actually said something similar, that the essence of anger is a perceived pain, whether justified or not, and a desire to do something about that pain. That's anathema to hubris, being about mere pleasure and the desire to put oneself above others, as hubris ignores the capacity for an individual to suffer the consequences for their action. Hubristoi believe that they are beyond consequences, and Demosthenes clearly demonstrates that Medius also shares said attitude, as we'll see in a bit. Returning to hubris and impiety, we again see this allegation leveled because Medius assaulted Demosthenes during the procession of the Dionysia. Now, if I had not been chorus master, men of Athens, when I was thus maltreated by Medius, it is only the personal insult that one would have condemned, but under the circumstances, I think one would be justified in condemning also the impiety of the act. You surely realize that all of your choruses and hymns to the god are sanctioned, not only by the regulations of the Dionysia, but also by the oracles, in all of which, whether given at Delphi or Dodona, you will find a solemn injunction to the state to set up dances after the ancestral custom, to fill the streets with the savor of sacrifice, and to wear garlands. Therefore, in the case of all the choruses that are constituted, together with their chorus masters, during the days on which we meet in the competition, these oracles make it clear that we wear our crowns as your representatives, the winner as well as the one destined to be last of all. It is not until the day of the prize giving that the victor receives his own special crown. If then a man commits a malicious assault on any member or master of these choruses, especially during the actual contest in the sacred precinct of the god, can we deny that he is guilty of impiety? For the record, as a person making this YouTube video, I would say no. But that's just me. You cannot deny that he is guilty of impiety. That is terrible. Again here, we have another link between impiety and hubris. The audacity of assaulting a chorus master, or the person who leads the dances and music playing for the gods honored at the festival being put on by the city-state, and doing so merely for one's own pleasure and aggrandizement, would surely be seen as both offensive to the gods and impious. If you are going to be an asshole, probably best to wait until after the festival to be one, because Agos is the last thing anyone wants to deal with. See the video previously from Miasma for what Agos is and why you really don't want to cause it. This is the first link we have to direct violence that isn't property destruction in the speech. We then get a recounting of how Medius tried to steal the property of Demosthenes out from under him, and Demosthenes sued him and won, as Medius didn't even show up, but then later tried to bribe the arbiter, Strato, to change the verdict. When this didn't work, he tried to bribe and blackguard those who kept the court records, then filed a complaint against Strato that was inaccurate in order to get him removed as arbiter. This shows another aspect of Aristotle's definition of hubris, the willingness to destroy the reputations of others in order to gain more honors or clout for yourself. He thought himself so above the law that he didn't even need to show up to his own trial to win. He could just bribe the court recorders and the arbiter with his vast wealth and be fine. Yeah, there are people like that in the modern day too. There are numerous other examples throughout the speech, but I'm sure this gives you an idea of some of the legal aspects of hubris. Assault, insults of character, bribing an official, and impious acts that defame the gods in an attempt to put another human being in a lower position all fall under that category. I won't get too deep into the more violent and non-consensual acts of hubris that involve bedroom-related offenses, as that's a bit beyond the scope of the channel, and we don't need YouTube getting any more angry with me than they already do. But that sort of assault, as well as adultery, both fell under hubris. So just know that if you were thinking about doing that, first off, don't anyway, but second, doubly don't, because it is also an offense to the gods. Because of when Medius chose to assault Demosthenes, he brought the charge of impiety and hubris against the gods alongside others, and that brings us to part 3, hubris and the gods. A large number of crimes and offenses against the gods specifically are labeled as hubris, even when there's also a human victim involved in said hubris. Sometimes, in the absence of human justice against the act, the gods were even said to intervene on the behalf of human victims of hubris. One of the first that comes to mind is the denying of proper honors to Achilles by Agamemnon in the Iliad, which Athena herself explicitly labels as hubris when she appears to Achilles in the middle of Book 1. Before she appears, Agamemnon explicitly strips Achilles of one of his rewards for the sheer battle prowess that he has displayed thus far in the war against Troy. Then the king of men, Agamemnon, answered him, "Flee them if your heart urges you. I do not beg you to remain for my sake. With me there are others who will honor me, and above all Zeus, the lord of counsel. Most hateful to me are you of the kings that Zeus nurtures, for always strife is dear to you, and wars and battles. If you are very strong, it was a god, I think, who gave you this gift. Go home with your ships and your companions and lord it over the Myrmidons. For you I care not, nor take heed of your wrath, but I will threaten you thus. As Phoebus Apollo takes from me the daughter of Chryses, her with my ship and my companions I will send back, but I will for myself come to your tent and take the fair-cheeked Briseis, your prize, so that you will understand how much mightier I am than you, and another may shrink from declaring himself my equal and likening himself to me to my face." If you recall the definitions of hubris from part 1, this seems pretty on the mark. Here, Agamemnon wrongfully denounces and shames Achilles, calling his strength and battle prowess merely a gift of the gods, saying that Achilles is the most hateful of kings, and finally stating directly that he's taking Briseis from Achilles to show specifically that he has power in the exchange, i.e. to raise his own status above Achilles for the pleasure of it. This is the textbook definition of hubris, and even the textbook hubristos, a king who steals from his warriors their due honors just to show off how powerful he is, ignoring the proper reciprocity due a warrior who had served faithfully under his command. Achilles, like all victims of hubris, gets royally pissed and wants revenge, but curiously, Athena appears and stays his hand. In lines 190 to 205, he addresses her directly and asks if she's there to witness the hubris of Agamemnon, which he speculates is gonna get him killed at some point. She tells him, "I have come from heaven to stay your anger, if you will obey. The goddess white-armed Hera sent me forth, and for in her love she cares for both of you. But come, cease from strife, and do not grasp the sword with your hand. With words indeed taunt him, telling him how it shall be, for thus I will speak, and this thing shall truly be brought to pass. Hereafter 3 times as many glorious gifts shall be yours on account of this arrogance, but refrain and obey us." These rewards do come, albeit very, very late in the story, when Agamemnon begs forgiveness from Achilles and returns Briseis as well as a much more appropriate share of the war booty. Although Achilles was destined to die later in the war from the beginning, his own acts of the story don't constitute hubris either, because when he drags the body of Hector, despite spiting the gods by refusing his burial, he is doing so out of the pain of anger and a desire for revenge over the death of his beloved Patroclus. Agamemnon, on the other hand, doesn't have an excuse beyond wanting to be better than Achilles and humiliate him publicly and tries to make it appear to others that this is so. And Achilles is well within his rights to refuse to fight despite the suffering that it inflicts on his fellow warriors. Hell, Achilles doesn't even take pleasure in that suffering either. It makes him feel bad, but his desire for revenge against Agamemnon is greater than that pity. And we know from Athena's pronouncement that the grievance is legitimate. And as we all know, Agamemnon does get his just desserts when he is both delayed getting home and is warmly greeted by a knife in the back from his wife, who has, until that point, been sleeping with his brother. Ruin comes for Hubristi indeed. The Odyssey's central conflict with the suitors is all about the hubris of said suitors and their violations of Xenia, which are repeatedly described as hubris by Odysseus, which is confirmed by Athena, who stokes the fires of his heart when he's disguised as a beggar and warns the suitors of how they've been screwing around her and about to find out the hard way. This is most exemplified in the moments where the suitors abuse Odysseus in his disguise as beggar, throwing things at him and kicking him, despite acting throughout the poem as though they own the house rather than trying to provide in return to the home that they've been despoiling as guests, as they're expected to under the laws of Xenia enforced by the gods. Antinous especially repeatedly abuses Odysseus, the beggar, who rebukes him thus. "But now you are indeed committing hubris, and your mind is ruthless, and you think you are some great man and strong because you associate with only a few and not good men." What Odysseus is saying here is that as a noble, the abuse Antinous and the suitors are laying on him in the guise of a beggar is hubristic, kicking the weak when they are down as discussed in Aristotle's definitions. But also, the reason he believes he is so virtuous is because he comes from a small community of similarly weak nobles, showing that hubris can be enforced by those who refuse to stand against it, and certainly was in this case. The acts of the suitors themselves are repeatedly described as hubristic. They refused to believe the gods would ever come to the door and ignored Athena when she actually does at the beginning, prompting Telemachus to seat her in disguise away from the raucous damaging of his home. Because he shows her proper courtesy, despite her apparent lower rank, she reveals to Telemachus that his father is still alive and suggests that he journey elsewhere seeking his fate, protecting him from the schemes of the nobles who wish to kill him. Their broken reciprocity and Odysseus' piousness are the major arguments that she presents to Zeus to enable her direct intervention. And of course, at the end, she enables Odysseus' direct revenge by blocking the blows of the suitors' spears when he takes his revenge at her behest. So it's clear that broken Xenia, when it's willful and specifically out of arrogant pride and a desire to know one's own superiority, as it was in the case of the suitors, constitutes hubris that the gods may intervene on. Likewise, in Hesiod's work and Days, we find that the corrupt kings and those who bribe them may also be facing a form of divine judgment for their corruptions of justice. If you're starting to see a pattern in the sorts of acts described by hubris and the things that might invite Agos, that's not a mistake. Hesiod tells us at the beginning of Works and Days that his brother, Peleus, already took a substantial portion of his father's estate after his passing, and has used that wealth primarily to bribe and entertain the kings of Boeotia, rather than investing himself and growing the estate through hard work. The poem was composed due to the second trial that Peleus threatened, but might not have actually been able to afford, to bribe the kings to rule in his favor. It's one of the most epic get-a-job tell-offs ever written, and Peleus will be forever remembered as Hesiod's lazy, scheming brother. Joke's on him, I guess. Nearly every line in the poem deals with the orders of things as established by the gods, but a few of them call out the hubris of rulers specifically and those who bribe them. Hubris, he tells Peleus, isn't any better for the peasants than it is for the kings. He contrasts it continuously with justice, Dike, and says that Zeus, who is patient, will one day right the wrongs done even by what he describes as lowly men. Perseus, you listen to Dike and do not foster hubris. Hubris is bad for a lowly man. Not even a good man can easily carry it, but he is weighed down by it, encountering disasters. The way is better to pass on the other side to what is just. Dike prevails over hubris when it comes to the finish. The fool learns through suffering. For the start, oath runs along the crooked judgments. A clamor goes up when Dike is dragged away to where men take her who devour gifts and judge Themistes with crooked judgments. But she, lamenting, follows on to the city and haunts of the people, clothed in mist, bringing harm to the men, those who have driven her out and did not deal her straight. So what he says here is that even those of lower class who commit hubris against one another and utilize the crooked systems of justice metered out by rulers corrupted by greed still get their justice from the gods in the end. This is implied that the drive for justice will be cultivated in the hearts of angry people who will rise up and remember those who use those crooked systems for their own short-term gain. Though earlier in the poem he also tells us that Zeus has destroyed several prior iterations of mankind for hubris because their lives were too easy and they both stopped honoring the gods and did horrible hubristic things against one another. We're told that the Age of Iron, our current age, will one day come to an end when the order of the gods is entirely eschewed for hubris. Men will swiftly dishonor their parents as they grow old and will criticize them, addressing them with harsh words, hard-hearted, not reckoning the vengeance of the gods, nor would they repay the cost of their nurture to their elderly parents. They take justice into their own hands and will sack the city of another. Nor will there be reciprocity for the man who keeps his oath, nor for the just man nor the good man, but rather men will honor the doer of evil and the man of hubris. Justice is in their hands and respect will not exist. The bad man will harm the better man, accusing him with crooked words, and will swear an oath on top. This compares hubris with elder abuse, disrespect for parents, and puts it in the same category as broken oaths and the perverted justice in the eyes of the gods, which we've already seen from previous videos that the gods punish oath breakers and those who harm kin. The social structures of charis, or reciprocity, xenia, proper human justice, piety, and kept oath were all seen as so sacrosanct that for them to disappear entirely would cause the gods themselves to give up on humanity, toss us in the bin, and just start over. Talk about direct punishment from the gods. This also complements later lines where he tells us that Zeus especially will send horrid plagues and disasters to any city whose rulers are so corrupted, meaning that even just people can suffer from hubris of their rulers. Solon too, in his Prayer to the Muses, also recognizes the tendency of Zeus to wait a hot minute and then rain on the parade of the hubristic with a thunderous vengeance. He tells us, "The wealth that the gods give stays with a man firm planted from the bottommost foundation to summit, whereas that which men pursue through hubris comes not in orderly wise, but under the constraint of unjust deeds. Against her will she follows, and swiftly ruin is mingled therewith. The beginning, as of a fire, arises from little, negligible at first. In its end is without remedy. The works of men's arrogance have no long life. Zeus watches over the end of all things, and all at once, like a wind that suddenly scatters the cloud, a wind of spring, that having stirred the deeps of the many billowed unharvest seas, and raised the fair works of husbandry over the wheat-bearing earth, reaches the abode of the gods, the lofty sky, and makes it bright again to behold. And the sun in his might shines fair over the rich earth. No longer is any cloud to be seen. Such is the retribution of Zeus. Basically, the wealth which the gods give for hard work, virtue, and goddess is guilt-free and wonderful and a blessing, contrary to what some modern pagans believe about asking the gods for things being a problem. But the wealth which is stolen through ill-gotten means comes burdened with a ticking time bomb. Agos. Agos is the bomb. And Zeus is the one said to strike when the time is right. The main theme of his prayer to the Mosai seeks wisdom from them that Solon himself may never become hubristic despite his power, and that his wealth and honors may come only from virtue, for the gods see so much further than humans, and it's easy for a person to think that the gods support unrighteous actions because they appear to be rewarding until suddenly they're not, and they realize they've been full of it all along. This is not an excuse to be scared that the gods are going to punish you for feeling proud of your legitimate achievements. It's a warning about being an asshole to others. Hubris is in the action, the stolen wealth, the deliberate theft of Briseis from Achilles, the squandering of Odysseus' estate by the suitors, the bribing and misuse of the corrupt kings by Peleus. Hubris is born in actions, but as we'll see in a moment, actions do have their roots in a sense of superiority that goes beyond ordinary pride and confidence. One of the most direct examples of how this attitude leads to hubristic acts is spelled out in the final speech of Darius in Aeschylus' Pursians, which is one of the few instances where thoughts are mentioned directly as a cause of hubris, though it's clearly meant that those thoughts led to hubristic acts, which is what made the people hubristai, not the thoughts themselves. This is a longer passage, so bear with me, but it's an important one, I think, for showing the relationship between thoughts which raise one above the gods and other humans and the later atrocities which one could describe as hubris. They wait where the Esopos waters the plain with its streams, a friendly enrichment for the Boeotians' land, where the extremes of evil await for them to suffer, payment for hubris and godless thinking. They came to the Greek land and showed no scruple to sack the images of the gods or to set fire of the temples. Altars are destroyed, the shrines of the gods uprooted in confusion are torn from their bases. Thereby, having performed evil deeds, they suffer no less, and have more to suffer. The spring of evils is not yet quenched, but is still gushing out. So great will be the blood-dripping liquid offering on the plain of the Plataeans made by the Dorian spear. Heaps of corpses, even to the third seeded generations, will signify silently to the eyes of men that, being mortal, one should not have excessive thoughts of hubris, blossoming, which have produced a crop of ate, or strife, and from it reaped a harvest full of sorrow. Seeing that such are the penalties for these things, remember, Athens and Greece, and let no man despise his existing fortune, and longing for others pour out a great prosperity. Zeus is indeed a chastiser of too overboastful thoughts, a strict auditor. In the face of this, Xerxes, who lacks good sense, you should counsel with a well-reasoned advice to cease from harming gods with overboastful rashness. This seems to imply that the thoughts themselves are hubris on a really surface reading, but we see pretty quickly this isn't the case. The men here were punished for their evil deeds brought about by their hubristic attitudes, so Darius is cautioning the audience not to cultivate these thoughts needlessly, so the temptation to act on them and thereby invoke the wrath of Zeus, again seen here as the deliverer of justice, never comes back in the first place. The concluding speech tells us that the youthful and impious Xerxes brought this upon himself for his rash overconfidence, the belief that he was immune to the punishments of the gods. However, nowhere in Aeschylus' work do we see a more detailed development of the concept of hubris than from the Oresteia. I covered the Oresteia in detail on my video on human sacrifice, links in the iCard if you missed it, and the actions of kinslaying and human sacrifice, as well as adultery, which is another form of hubris as covered in part 1, are punished by Apollon, who empowers Orestes to seek vengeance. In Agamemnon, we get a direct reference of the act of kinslaying on the part of Aegisthus from being hubris from the chorus. He gloats about the death, recounting the tragedy of the house of Atreus and Pelops, and gloating that he had planned out this murder to exact revenge on his brother for inheriting his father's house and driving him out. The chorus replies, "Aegisthus, I do not reverence committing hubris in misfortune. You say that of your own intent you slew this man, and did alone plot this pitiful murder. I tell you the hour of justice that you yourself be sure of that will not escape the people's curses and death by stoning at their hand. Basically, just because you suffered some BS doesn't mean you should turn around and commit an act against the gods and use that misfortune as your excuse. The people will likely kill you if the gods don't first. Earlier in the play, we're told that a venerable utterance proclaimed of old has been fashioned among mankind. The prosperity of man, when it has come to full growth, engenders offspring and does not die childless. And from his good fortune there springs up insatiable misery. But I hold my own mind and think apart from other men. It is the evil deed that afterwards begets more iniquity like its own breed. But when a house is righteous, the lot of its children is blessed, always. But an old hubris tends to bring forth in evil men, sooner or later at the fated hour of birth, a young hubris and that irresistible, unconquerable, unholy spirit, recklessness. And for the house hold black curses which resemble their parents, but righteousness shines in smoke-begrimed dwellings that esteems virtuous man. From gilded mansions where men's hands are foul, she departs with averted eyes and makes her way to pure homes. She does not worship the power of wealth with stamped counterfeit by the praise of men, and she guides all things to their proper end. This reminds us immediately of what Solon says, that goodness begets good, but so too hubristic ideas and attitudes carry through the generations when they're taught and passed down. It takes someone like Orestes, pious and called by the gods, to break the cycle with the intervention of said gods and set things right in a house afflicted by such. This doesn't mean everyone with crappy parents is doomed to repeat their mistakes, but it does caution us that care must be taken with what influences we allow to shape us, similarly to the warnings that Odysseus gave to Ariston about how his buddies were just reinforcing his inflated ego, and he wasn't as hot shit as he thought he was. We see this even more powerfully in the Eumenides, when the chorus tells us, "There is a place where what is dreadful is good and must remain seated there watching over men's minds. There is a benefit in learning to be sensible under constraint. How can anyone, any city, or any mortal that does not foster in the heart fear, still alike have reverence for justice? Neither the life without rules nor the life under which a despot should be your praise. Zeus has granted the power to everything in the middle, but other things he watches over in another way. I speak a moderate word to the case. Hubris is really the child of impiety, but from the good luck of the mind comes after what is dear to all and much prayed for, prosperity. For in every case I tell you to respect the altar of Dike, do not, having an eye to profit with godless foot, dishonor it by kicking, for the penalty will be there, a sovereign end awaits. Therefore let a man rightly honor first the reverence of his parents, and for the xenos honoring attentions of the house let him show respect, and so without constraint he will be just and will not be without prosperity, and never will he come to utter ruin. But I say that the man transgressing in bold opposition, collecting and dragging all things off without decay and violently, in time will lower his sail, when trouble takes him and his yardarm shatters. He calls to those who hear nothing, in the middle of the eddy hard to wrestle with. The daimon laughs at the hot-tempered man, seeing the man who boasted never, enfeebled in the irresistible sorrows and unable to round the headland. Forever, having run his former prosperity over the reef of Dike, he is perished, unwept, unseen. Basically, those who become hubristic forget the gods do care about how we treat one another, just not to the thought-monitoring, I know what you did under the blanket last night staring at your phone screen levels of the Christian god. A healthy fear of hubris means going out of your way not to be an asshole to other people. Don't swindle people out of money, scam them because in your mind you think you can get away with it, kill your family members, sack a temple during a war, torment a guest or someone who is hosting you for the fun of it, refuse to bury a family member because in death you're better than them, or ruin someone's reputation for your own enjoyment, and you should probably be fine. It's pretty clear that pride itself, when deserved and earned, is not the problem. The feeling of abject superiority that enables horrendous actions leads to actions that would be described as hubris. Say it with me, my thoughts themselves are not hubris. It is probably good to watch them to make sure you're not kicking people when they're down just for your own amusement, but I think most of us have a strong enough moral compass to know that's wrong. Most other examples of mythic hubris involve kinslaying, escape from Hybris, which most of us probably have zero chance of doing, or trying to feed the gods human meat or other outrageously ridiculous things. My point is, there's a pretty limited scope to what kind of hubristic acts a modern person could commit, and now that you know what they are, it's probably pretty easy to avoid them. So I hope this helps you feel a little less terrified that the gods are mad at you if you ever dealt with that particular fear. Either way, thank you so much for sticking through that. If you're new here, bring the subscribe button to the Graphe Hubris and condemn its crimes against the like. Drop down into the comments and let me know if you learned anything, where you sit with these debates and how they might apply to your life. Special thanks also to my incredibly patient patrons, who let me take an entire extra month on this video due to triggering events in my own life that made working on the research for it really hard. This one has been in the works for months, and I may do follow-up work delving into some of the more nuanced aspects of either either mythic or legal hubris in future videos if folks request it. May the cycle of reciprocity between us ever remain positive. And remember, we're stronger together.